Because the main business of the evening is to hear from our speaker, but I had a few remarks I wanted to make beforehand, just to sort of set the stage a little bit for his session. He's going to talk for a while. He refuses to say for how long, which puts the chairperson in a bit of a dilemma. But and I have to defer to him because he's such a senior and important fellow. Then we'll have time for questions and discussion afterwards, I hope. Now, Irvin Jim has had an exciting and boldly defined career. But like his union, South Africa's National Union of Metalworkers, Numsa, he has an even more exciting and boldly defined present and future before him. This latter is something we can expect to hear more about tonight. The man and the movement, then. First, briefly, the man, Irvin Jim himself. A student and township activist in the anti-apartheid struggle on the ground in South Africa in the late 1980s, he first entered the workplace as a rubber worker at the Firestone Tires factory in the early 1990s, quickly becoming a union activist and, at the age of 23, a shop steward. Soon he became both the regional Numsa chairperson for the Eastern Cape and also the youngest member of Numsa's Central Committee, Numsa itself being amongst the largest trade unions in the entire country. Finally, in 2008, he was elected General Secretary of Numsa nationally, a position he continues to occupy today. Thus, the man. But what of the moment? Many of us have felt forced to acknowledge that the ANC has failed the vast majority of South Africans themselves, having opted pretty unapologetically for global capitalism, neoliberalism, and its own multiplying elite privileges, or merely allowing stark inequality and marginalization to grow and fester, more or less unchecked. Not that South Africans themselves have accepted this outcome of their struggle entirely passively. Indeed, South Africa is currently at the very top of the world's list of countries as marked by high rates of local demonstrations, protests, and unease acted upon by township and rural dwellers throughout the country. Indeed, such militancy has come to be termed by one close observer as having become, in the ostensibly new South Africa, a virtual rebellion of the poor. But how will this remarkable level of dissent find truly effective voice as a counter-hegemonic alternative to the fierce grip of the ANC and the SACP on the country, if the organized trade union movement does not itself begin to speak up and to act out more dramatically? True, COSATU, as South Africa's most powerful trade union umbrella organization, had itself played a noble role in the long struggle against apartheid. But it cut itself a deal for power with the ANC SACP from quite early on, even though it was destined to become only a junior, if occasionally somewhat fractious, partner in the new alliance that came to rule South Africa. The grip of that triple alliance, ANC, SACP, COSATU, was graphically shaken, however, by the Marikana massacre of August 2012, when the state opened fire on striking workers, killing some 36 of them. After that, and further evidence of corruption and a deep complicity with capital, it was increasingly difficult not to acknowledge, in a growing number of quarters, the need, quite simply, for a new liberation struggle. It is within such a national setting that Numsa, long an independently minded union in any case, and like Irvin Jim, its leader, who is with us tonight, profoundly skeptical well before Marikana of the ANC's neoliberal choice, has in recent months and years stepped forward even ever more dramatically, beginning to move away sharply from the very concept of the ANC-led tripartite alliance and move instead towards something new. In doing so, it has committed itself both to struggling imaginatively within the House of Labour for the very soul of COSATU, a firm commitment evidenced most recently at a special Congress in December of last year. Oh no? Don't give up. And as the steelworkers' own Judith Marshall, who's here tonight, has effectively recounted in a report on her attendance at the event that has been published in this week's Bullet from Toronto's Socialist Project, this month Numsa anchored a dramatic resistance expo, a political school designed quite self-consciously to reach out to a wide range of community organizations and activists within civil society, those who had in fact already been at the center of South Africa's rebellion of the poor. However, this new alliance of forces that Numsa and Irvin Jim seek to assist to grow is defined quite specifically to revive South Africa's social purpose in the name of, wait for it, socialism, and around the self-conscious action of the vast mass of South Africans. We are witnessing then an historic moment in the possible defining by South Africans of a new liberation struggle against the continuing domination of their country by global capital and against an increasingly corrupt and high-handed ANC government. But our guest tonight, Irvin Jim, the man of the moment, if you will, is without doubt the one best qualified to help us to understand this moment more clearly. I give you then Irvin Jim, the General Secretary of the National Union of Metalworkers of South Africa, Numsa.
Thanks, John, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I must say that initially I thought of a formal process of talking to you tonight, but I felt we should keep it interactive. But I will tell you the story, which is not a difficult story to understand. It is true that the National Union of Metalworkers of South Africa has been among the revolutionary forces in our country right back during the dark days of the apartheid system in our country. A system which in 1994, in what we characterize as democratic breakthrough, we basically defeated it. And I must say, in terms of the form of the revolution. Because something very important, which I think we will continue to celebrate, is that in 1994, for the first time in the history of South Africa, black people in general, Africans in particular, voted. And I must say that date came after we lost a giant of our struggle. There was a very protracted process of negotiations, but there was no date when will the election take place. The date, how it came about, Comrade crises, who was the most feared, the most resolute cadre of the Liberation Alliance, who was the General Secretary of the South African Communist Party, was killed. And South African workers, sometimes they do sing a very important song, because up to today we do not know who killed crises. They do sing a very important song, and at the time Thabo Mbeki was in power, they would sing this song that says, Thabo Mbeki siyabuza, who killed crises in Thad. Chris had to die because I think we can add up today, because he was very resolute leader of the working class, who, when everybody else was preparing nice suits and everything else to occupy the center of power, which was Parliament, Chris was very clear that he was to remain with the masses. He was clear that there was a need to mobilize the working class as a class for itself. And I must say that that date was both as a result of 4 pillars of our struggle that made apartheid to be completely ungovernable, which was mass mobilization, underground structures of our movement, isolation of South Africa on trade as a result of the anti-apartheid movement, and the role you people here in Canada, in solidarity with the people of South Africa, you have played. But because the apartheid system was very brutal, it was very arrogant, against peaceful demonstration, it reacted by basically an onslaught of violence. It was ready to kill. And Mkondo Wesizwe, which was the fourth pillar of our struggle, had to be one of those pillars that we have to accept. And I'm summarizing these pillars. They never came in through a boardroom. They actually came in the actual theater of struggle, where basically the working class and the youth of that working class in our country had to stand together and say, apartheid is a crime against humanity, and we will stop at nothing except to take up the fight to defeat it. And I must say that when 1994 came through, we were all very excited because for the first time we voted in our own country. Those who were young, we had absolutely no youth. We were in the street, we were singing obvious song, Chisimelo Yellow, because the police, they were occupying our township. They were doing everything that was brutal. And it was hardly a couple of months after that democratic breakthrough. We quickly appreciated that something was flawed. It was clear that what we secured in that democratic breakthrough was political power without economic power. Of course, bourgeois democracy was the bourgeois rights that we access. You can, and you were allowed, and you are still allowed, to take your children to a school of your own choice. There were no longer buses for whites and buses for blacks. There were no longer toilets for blacks and toilets for whites. You can take your children to a school of your own choice. You can choose where to stay. There was no longer Group Areas Act, which said to you at 6 o'clock you can't be in town. So you could be anywhere else. But something that was very clear was that access to those rights is determined by your economic position in society. If you have no access to the economy, if you don't live a middle class life, then your children will still be in township schools, and township schools to date are still township schools. It is those few who live a middle class life who basically are able to ensure that they take the children to the schools of their own choice. And I think what, at the same time in 1995, 1996, emerged very glaringly was the pressure to the Liberation Alliance, in particular the ANC, rating agencies, saying that the Reconstruction and Development Program is a very ambiguous program. The ANC needed to come up with a very clear policy which could satisfy the World Bank, the WTO, and all those who meet every now and again in Davos. And this was coined that if South Africa wanted investments, it needed to come up with a very clear policy. This was happening against a very clear background that the working class that have championed the revolution in South Africa, for instance, our own union was in the forefront of packaging together Reconstruction and Development Program. At the back and at the center of Reconstruction and Development Program was the whole question, which was basically embodied in the Freedom Charter, which is the aspiration of the people of South Africa, who in 1955 assembled in Kliptown, who basically decided that the national wealth of our country must be shared. You know, the Freedom Charter that addressed the economic question, because it said that mineral wealth, banks and monopoly industries should be transferred to the ownership of the people. Right back in 1969 in Morogoro, the working class, which Chris and them were part of, I was actually talking to John here that one of the things that Morogoro was very important about, and we also know that Chris Hani had to go through a number of problems because he questioned why, when the people were ready in the country, why the leadership in exile was not on top of the situation, why their sons and daughters were enjoying quality education all over the world when the sons and daughters of the working class were in trouble. But there's something very important about Morogoro Conference which actually resolved on the strategy and tactics of the ANC in 1969. Morogoro said, we in fact, they visualize future South Africa. It says we do not underestimate the anonymity of future challenges that the ANC government, when it is in power, it will be confronted with. However, that government would have to ensure that the basic wealth of the country is restored back to the ownership of the people as a whole, not to be manipulated by individuals, be they white or black. So I was saying to John, Morogoro has got a special place. And we can characterize that because all the hard choices within the Liberation Alliance, it was the working class advanced detachment of the working class that basically took those particular sacrifices and to a point where there was a clear revolutionary program which was supposed to be executed. And I'm saying the pressure from rating agencies and Davos and the whole Washington consensus at the back of globalization, which was presented as a panacea. I mean, when Mandela walked out of prison, he was very clear that nationalization was the policy of the ANC. He didn't mince words. It took him a couple of trips even to your friends next door here across in the US. And he came back very arrogant, as you know him. He said, the market is the policy of the ANC. And since then, in 1996, he then unilaterally introduced GEAR. And it was GEAR, written very short, growth, employment, and redistribution. And because as the working class, we were there in formulating reconstruction and development program, we were the first in COSATU and its affiliates to say this is a wrong policy for the country. GEAR was bad for the country because even though we accepted that we can no longer be a country that is not linked to the rest of the world in terms of trade, but it was important for us that if we would have convinced you and convinced the rest of the world that apartheid was a crime against humanity, you should have been with us in the struggle to undo both the legacy of the apartheid and to rebuild the country, which was basically destroyed by the apartheid regime. But what did GEAR do? GEAR basically liberalized trade, destroying many jobs across various sectors of the economy. GEAR basically every year, the National Treasury was at the center of removing exchange control, allowing money to leave South Africa, allowing South African companies to list in London and in Melbourne into financial speculation. And surely that's money that we needed to be invested in productive sectors of the economy. In 2007 alone, we lost 25% of the GDP through capital flights, and this has been happening. And our own Reserve Bank continues to target inflation. It does not target jobs. Privatization was the order of the day. In 2002, we had to take rolling mass action to fight against privatization. They were privatizing everything, municipal services and so forth. GEAR championed belt tightening at a time when we needed to have massive public infrastructure and spending. And because they allow money to leave the country, they have to keep the interest rate very high so that they can only attract capital inflows, which is money that is targeting those interest rates and the returns of those who speculate. Again, that money doesn't go to productive sectors of the economy. Privatization of strategic commanding heights of the economy have been what GEAR delivered to us. We used to have ISCO, which is a steel plant, which used to be in the hands of the state, which created jobs, which gave hardcore skills to Afrikaner working class. Suddenly, ISCO, which now called ArcelorMittal, was basically given into private hands. It is charging import parity pricing, and therefore downstream industries where we with the potential to create jobs, we basically cannot be able to enjoy that particular benefit. But we got steel in the country. We got Sasol on petrochemicals, which is selling polymers above global prices. So if you want to use that supply to produce plastic and everything else, you need to set up a plant in China and leave South Africa. But the jobs are required in the country. So as the labor movement and as COSATU, as Numsa, we have consistently championed that there is a need to dump these neoliberal policies, where there was a need to accept that this Washington consensus is basically not working. And I guess it didn't just fail us. In 2008, Washington consensus basically collapsed globally. It has been discredited. And the capitalist neoliberal priests, instead of basically waking up, I mean, it has been the United States that have been giving prescription, which has been telling developing countries what is to be good, pursuing foreign direct investment as a strategy. Instead of investors to come to South Africa, we saw South African capitalists taking production out of the country, targeting low-cost areas in the continent to exploit the working class. But we saw what happened in 2008. US, which have been giving all those countries those prescriptions, they basically intervened to save banks and to save plants in the interests of capital and themselves. But when it comes to developing countries who were given that prescription, they are still continuing with all that. Well, what has been our strategy? Our strategy has been to think that we can swell the ranks, we can influence the ANC from within. And I must say that for the past 20 years, we have done that. And in 2012, there was a situation where basically the ANC called on all of us to say, look, there must be a dialogue. We thought they were agreeing or they were accepting the failures of those policies, but they confirmed publicly that the policies that they pursued, they failed to deal with the triple crisis of poverty, unemployment, and inequalities. So we participated in that process with vigor. I remember Numsa attacking the ANC for even saying the constitution, which is with the property clause, is up for debate. And de Klerk Foundation, so de Klerk made a very good thing. He made sure that he protect the property owning class. He made sure that he protect white monopoly capital. He made sure that he protect the minority, which is white population that owns and controls the South African economy. And I think we can say now that we think that a deal was done. I think we can say it boldly, that a deal was done, and that deal was that instead of maintaining a very expensive, and I think there's somebody who wrote on this by the name of John Pilger. John Pilger, when Mbeki was finally recalled in 2007, he raised a fundamental question. He says that recall of Thabo Mbeki reminded him of the collapse of Johannesburg Stock Exchange in 1985. Because in 1985, P.W. Botha, mad as he was, and I'm sure he's still mad in the grave today, when he was expected by everybody else to come up with reforms, he basically escalated and announced how brutal measures that he was still going to execute. And he was racist like you can't believe. John Pilger says that recall of Mbeki reminded of that speech. And he makes serious allegations, and look, I mean, this could be a conspiracy theory, but he says the mining oligarchy, which steals, own, and control together with finance capital, minerals, energy, and finance complex, which is own and control the structure of South African economy, which up to today is not being transformed, is not beneficiated. It is just about extraction. I mean, the ANC government, if you go there now, they will tell you that we're spending massively in terms of infrastructure, but on what? They are still spending on extraction of our minerals. Those minerals are not being beneficiated to create jobs and to benefit South African people. When we say, can't you impose export tax so that those who are interested, who are interested in our minerals, instead of taking them raw, they must set up plants and actually process them in South Africa so that we can get spin-offs. No, they're not willing to do that. We have been calling for ban of scrap for so many years. We have lost about 7 foundries that had to close because scrap those who collect scrap, they are just making money by taking our scrap and take it to China.